What's up, y'all? We are in the midst of the great reset of 2025. Man, not just it's the red wedding, baby. Just they are slashing and just discounting and moving on from dudes. I don't remember anything like this in a very long time. But I want to come on because I think there's a lot of thoughts out there and there's a lot of people that are freaking out, especially because, like, I was talking with somebody yesterday, the one thing that you always see is whenever there's big names that get released or let go, right, or they sign elsewhere, right? Hufunga, Dre Greenlaw, God, there's so many to even name. Leonard Floyd, like these guys are big names, right? They've been around the league a long time. So instant reaction, especially around the league, is like, who's going to play football for the 49ers next year? Like, what are they going to do? Kyle Juszczyk's another one. I think the fact of the matter is, though, like everyone needs to take like a step back, right? The 49ers have clearly outlined their plans of what they're trying to do. They're hitting the reset button. I don't want to hear anybody come out and say, oh, it's a retool. Nope, it's a rebuild. But I think the thing that people miss the most is the reason why the NFL is the best sport in the world is resets don't have to be 3, 5, 10-year processes, right? If they've identified their quarterback in Brock Purdy, which they say they have, reboots are quick, right? They had a good draft last year. They are one draft away, and a few signings. Like this could still very much be a playoff team, right? I don't know about necessarily contending for the Super Bowl next year. It's also important to be realistic, but just because they're moving on from all these guys, I think the one message I want to convey out to fans is it doesn't mean they're going to win 2 games, right? Like there's still a lot of talent on this team. I think, if you take a step back once again and look at what last season, what happened, right? They obviously felt like, look, we just came off of a Super Bowl overtime loss to the Chiefs. We still got a lot of really good football players that are in their prime. I had argued that they were towards the tail end of their prime, but nonetheless, they didn't want to blow it up, right? They wanted to run this thing back and give it another go. And I don't really blame them, right? I think that they could have made some of these moves last year and it wouldn't be as drastic, right? If you let 2 or 3 guys go, for instance, then it is a little bit more of a retool. But they obviously gave it another go. It completely backfired. All 4 wheels came off the car. They slammed into the wall. Game over. So they're hitting that reset button now. But again, fans that are freaking out about some of these names and people that are used to seeing out there on Sundays wearing the red and gold, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I think the one thing, if you're being very realistic and you watch the all 22 and you really watch these games, is it was very clear all season long. The team was old. They were slow. They were not dynamic at all, especially on defense. Like the only game that they looked fast and explosive was the Jets game right out of the gates. Outside of that, the only time I could really look back into last season off the top of my head and remember, wow, this team is flying around and making plays on defense was when Dre Greenlaw played one half of football against the Rams. That's it. Outside of that, I cannot think of a game last season where consistently I look back and say, wow, defense brought it that day. They were making plays. They were hitting people, interceptions, sacks, jumping around, celebrating. There was no juice on that defense last year. So I don't really mind all the changes, to be totally honest with you. I think Hufunga, looking out there, I think, I wish him the best. He was obviously a really good 49er. Injuries started to pile up. He was not able to, get back to that season that he had a few years ago. Dre Greenlaw, love the guy. I think more importantly than his play necessarily is how are they going to replace kind of that dog mentality that he brought to the team and to the defense, right? That's really important for any team, but especially these guys as they hit that reboot button. Fred Warner and Bosa are great, but Greenlaw was a different kind of dude. And they need to replace that more than they do the production on the field, because I think you can go out and find really good linebackers, both free agency as well as in the draft. There's a lot of really good players coming out. So my point being, don't freak out over some of these names, right? If you really go through them and really take a deep dive into their production and what they brought to the team last year, there's a pretty good reason why this team won 6 games. Like, yeah, there were injuries, right? Trent goes down, CMC goes down, like, not great. You can't lose core guys like that. But at the end of the day, like, the other guys also didn't pick up the slack, right? So that's kind of big picture focus. I'm going to throw up an image here that Cam Inman put out this morning. Boy, this team's going to look different next year, though. And honestly, again, I don't think it's the worst thing. You've got guys on the offense, right? Debo, gone. Banks, gone. Feliciano, gone. Juszczyk, gone. We'll see what happens with Aiyuk here. I don't really know what to expect. I think any day everybody is now kind of numb to it and really expecting him to get traded, to be totally honest with you. On the defensive side of the ball, I'm not even going to list all the guys that are leaving. Nick Bosa, Fred Warner, Lenoir, and J.R. Brown is the only returning players on the defense. That's it from the starting unit. When you look down at the reserves as well, a lot of guys that are going to be turning over here. I think there was a few moves that were made, be totally honest with you, that I'm a little bit hesitant on. Let me take a step back. I don't think like them being inactive necessarily in free agency is a bad thing, right? Again, I think this team needed a turnover. Like, it really did. You can't just continuously pay everybody. You can't pay mediocre or above average players, wild contracts, which they have done. Like, there's been too many like people out there. I mean, I said it last year at the beginning. I would have absolutely traded Aiyuk last offseason. You could have gotten a first round pick, possibly second round for sure. It was the move. It was absolutely the move. They were headstrong about it. They didn't do it. Now they're paying the price. Debo could have moved on from him last year. Kyle Juszczyk could have moved on from him last year and started to pivot that offense. They didn't do these things. So I think this team is ready for a reboot. The moves that like they lost, the only one again, Greenlaw, but you can't just pay 2 linebackers that kind of money, right? And I think that's something that they're kind of learning the hard way. Like, their roster was incredibly top heavy last year. And it was top heavy for a lot of aging players. Well, what happens to aging players in the NFL? They get hurt. So when you look back and you're like, wow, they had $100 million on the injury reserve. It's like, yeah, it was like 3 guys that are all in their 30s. What'd you expect to happen? So this team needs to get more depth. They need to get faster, more dynamic, younger, explosive, like all the adjectives that you want to use. The moves that like I don't really agree with for free agency, like Richie Grant, I keep hearing people talk about him a little bit. Look, I don't mind adding him because I think he's going to be a dynamic special teams player and he's a good depth player, obviously. But Richie Grant is not going to change or shouldn't change their plans at the safety position for the upcoming season, right? Like, this is a guy that was pretty poor in PFF, and when you look at the film a couple years ago, there's a reason why they went out and got Jesse Bates and Justin Simmons last year, the Falcons. Like, they were not happy with Grant. They went and upgraded. Grant went to the bench, played special teams, filled in here defensively here and there. So I don't mind him as a player, obviously, but to expect him to come in and like all of a sudden kick like Jair Brown to the special teams unit and like never going to see the field, like I would be a little bit hesitant on that. The other one, the tight end that we signed yesterday, he is not, I don't think, going to be. I mean, they gave him a lot of money, but like people keep talking about, oh, how is he going to replace Juice? Like, guys, you got to get, I think, that out of your brain right away. They're not replacing Juice. They're moving on from Juice, and they are moving kind of to a newish offense. They are moving to more 2 tight end, 3 receiver sets, 12 personnel, 13 personnel, whatever you want to call it. I think they're moving away from the fullback. I think they're finally recognizing, or maybe it's being handed down to Kyle, that like you don't really need a fullback in 2025, especially if you're going to be paying your quarterback $25 million. Now, you want to play action football and run between the tackles and go heavy personnel with a fullback and, 22 package. Okay. We're not paying a quarterback $55 million to do that. That doesn't make sense. Right. So I think all this stuff is starting to really click, and yeah, the Purdy contract makes a difference. Like, they are going to build an offense that is more tailored to him, guys who can separate against man coverage, And Kyle Juszczyk doesn't do that. Kyle Juszczyk didn't really require any kind of defender on him last year in the passing tree because he's a fullback. So what threat was there? So I think it's the right time to move on from him. I still think I hope they add another dynamic tight end, a little bit more in the receiving game. And I think they're going to add a few more receivers, like no doubt about it. I think they're moving to a little bit more of a traditional offense. I don't expect them to go, full spread, Josh Allen style out there, 5 receiver sets and bomb it down the field. But I do think they're changing, and that's a good thing for this team. The other piece that I wanted to kind of touch on real quick is the running back room. So I posted a tweet this morning. They tendered Jordan Mason with a second round tender, which comes at a price tag of about $5 million if they don't match it. To me, that's way too much. Like, I think Jordan Mason's a really good player. I think number one, I would be surprised if someone comes in hard and matches that up at $5 million. In the sense, it has to give up a second round pick, right? Like, that's a lot, especially when you look at this loaded running back class. I mean, there's not just Ashton Gianci, right? You've got Hampton, you've got Travion Henderson, you've got Judkins, you've got Caleb Johnson, the list just goes freaking on. Cam Scatterbo, like, there are so many running backs. I would be floored if a GM is like, you know what? Instead of taking Travion Henderson, let's go ahead and spend a second round pick on Jordan Mason and pay that guy $5 million, a guy who can't stay healthy. And that's my biggest gripe with it. I think Jordan Mason's a really good player. This is a guy who banged up his shoulder last year, had to come out and miss games. I'm pretty sure he also had an ankle injury last season, high ankle sprain, missed games. Now that's your primary $5 million backup to Christian McCaffrey, who's coming off double Achilles tendonitis and a PCL injury. So running backs 1 and 2 are, coming off major injuries last season. And then you got Guerendo, who also was banged up. He had a foot injury. I don't know if he had a toe. Maybe I'm making that up. But he definitely had a foot injury earlier in the season. And then later in the season against the Cardinals, luckily, I don't know how he came out of this without a major knee injury, but he did. But all 3 of their running backs are banged up dudes. And now I'm hearing that they're in talks potentially of reuniting with Raheem Mostert. I'm so much against that, I can't even begin to describe it. A 33-year-old running back who was once built off of like a speed game is probably not the answer for this team. Like, based on everything we've just talked about and everything we've seen as far as them just letting guys go, moving on from guys, younger, faster, more dynamic, guys who can stay healthy, guys that can bring a different element. That doesn't really scream a 33, 34-year-old running back, again, who's built off of speed, who was outplayed and beat out in Miami last year by Devin Achane. Now, Achane's really good, but like, why would we take the scraps off of Miami when we could just go and draft a guy in the 4th or 5th or 6th round who is going to bring the same thing up? Rashard Smith from SMU, RJ Harvey from UCF. Like, all those guys are burners. Devin Neal from Kansas. Like, go get one of those guys. Like, what are we doing here? I would be so upset if they go and re-sign Raheem Mostert. But yeah, that's kind of my rant. Last thing I wanted to touch on, offensive line, right? So again, highlight, I think it's a good thing that they're turning this thing over and they're moving in the other direction. The youth movement is coming. It is going to allow this team to enter the draft with, yes, a lot of holes, but with that comes is you can just take best player available. It doesn't matter if they're a receiver. It doesn't matter if they're an offensive lineman. It doesn't matter if they're, a running back, linebacker, DN, edge, tackle, whatever. If they're awesome, chances are there's a hole on this roster that they can step in and make a meaningful contribution here in 2025. And I do appreciate that approach. It should allow them rounds 1 through 7 and their 11 picks or whatever they have now to just go full balls to the wall, go get the best football players you can. If they can go get 4, 5, 6 starters in this draft, again, I think they're right there in playoff contention again this year. Like, they bounce back quickly. Even with 70+ million in caps and dead cap, that would be a team. If you're telling me they're taking one step back, going to reset the roster, going to reset the cap, they're going to pay Brock Purdy, let's say, let's say they crack the playoffs, maybe win a playoff game, maybe they don't, but they crack the playoffs, and then next year they enter with like $100 million in cap space, and Brock Purdy's under contract and everything's rolling. Dude, I'll take that all day. I absolutely will. The one thing to me that has to be addressed here is center. If we go into the season with Jake Brendel as the option and the probable starter at center, I will write this whole thing off. This team will not win a lot of football games. You have to protect Brock Purdy. You have to get this offensive line fixed, not only for Purdy, but for the running game. If you're not going to be using a fullback in Kyle Juszczyk, that leaves a lot more guys susceptible to one-on-one situations. If you're going to have Jake Brendel be, once again, manned up at the center position, this team's not going anywhere. They just won't. Like, Jake Brendel's days are his best days are far behind him. This team needs to get more athletic and more dynamic at the center position. And my whole thought process is, if you are hitting the reset button and you are getting younger and more, all those adjectives we talked about, go draft your replacement for him. Go draft Jared Wilson in the second or third round. Go draft Jake Majors in the third or fourth round. Like, just go get your guy, plug him in, just like the Chiefs did with Creed Humphrey, just like the Ravens did with Linderbaum. I'm trying to think of the others. I put a whole list out last night. Like, it's not impossible. Kyle's system is not, like you're trying to, rediscover a language that's been extinct for 600 years. Like, the offense is okay. These guys can pick it up. Trust me. And if he can't, if they're struggling with the line protections, then why don't you do what every other team does and let your quarterback do that? That's why you're paying him $55 million, right? So, in my opinion, you got to find a way to get the best 22 players on the field, or 11 at a time. And that should include probably a rookie center. Go get a young, really good rookie center who was able to hold up in the SEC most likely. So they're not going to get bullied around and overmatched. They might be a little bit behind in terms of schematics and line calls and things like that. Then coach them up. That's what your job is. Coach them up, get the best guys on the field, get your center in there that can grow with Brock Purdy and can grow with the rest of the offensive line. And you will look back in a year or 2 years, especially when it's your reset season, and be like, wow, that was the best decision we ever made. We took our lumps early on with him. And now this guy is a hopefully bona fide center and leader of our offensive line for the next decade. That's what they need to go do. Stop trying to put Band-Aids and duct tape all over this offensive line. Stop trying to go get journeymen that are, often injured and can't even make it a whole season, or guys that have been jet-setted by other organizations. And because your scheme is so fantastic and amazing, like, we can cover that up. No, you really can't. Because every time we get into a big game, especially against teams like the Chiefs or the Bills or the Ravens, we get absolutely punked in the trenches. Go out and finally go get some bona fide blue chippers and some big dogs on that offensive line, and let's start going toe-to-toe with some of these teams when it really matters. That's it. That's my kind of thoughts at the beginning of free agency here to kind of kick off the new year for the Niners. The great reset's underway. Embrace it. I know this team hasn't been fantastic drafting, as I've outlined over the last, 7-8 years, but this is still the way you build. You have to hit the reset button. You keep your core players intact and paid, and you fill in the gaps with free agency, but mainly you rebuild and restock through the draft. That's how it's done. That's how winning organizations sustain success. They're finally acknowledging that. Now it's time to put it into action. So stay optimistic. We'll see how this thing plays out. Later.